What are the signs that a country is heading towards a catastrophe? When there is social unrest due to the acute shortage of necessary items. When the political heads are forced to resign and run for their lives. When exams get cancelled over a shortage of printing paper. When power cuts force doctors to conduct surgeries with mobile lights. These are some of the grim realities that the island country of Sri Lanka is going through. The economic and political crisis has given way to a humanitarian crisis in the country. Reason? The human tendency to accumulate more and more for the self. This tendency manifested in the form of one-family dictatorship in Sri Lanka, which turned the nation into a one-family state that controlled a major portion of the country's budget. Years of economic mismanagement, corruption, money laundering, and appeasement politics brought about every possible luxury to a selected few. Of course, that came at the cost of the basic necessities of over 2 crore residents. The constitution was amended and the legislations were brought in to suit the needs of those in power. The absence of accountability and ill-informed policy decisions of the successive governments has sent the country into utter chaos. Conditions were worsened by the COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. At this point, I can't help but remember Murphy's Law. Here is our lesson number 1. A wrong choice of people's representative can weaken the democratic roots and impede the nation-building process. So we need to stay informed and work towards elevating our consciousness that will enable us to choose our representatives wisely. The economic crisis was long in the making. It could no longer be hidden after 2019. A series of disastrous decisions followed by a combination of shocks is the reason why the nation is grappling with its worst economic crisis in 7 decades. Let us begin by talking about the Sri Lankan civil war and its economic impact. The Sinhalese are in majority in Sri Lanka and Tamils are in minority. The successive Sinhalese governments equated the nation with the majority community and discriminated against the Tamils. There were episodes of targeted sectarian violence against the Tamils. It damaged the country's pluralist character and composite culture and raised ethnic tensions, ultimately leading to the civil war. This kept away the suitable environment for economic prosperity. The defense spending was increased substantially, which meant lesser money for development. That impeded economic growth. Foreign investments were hit during periods of civil war. The economic cost of the civil war is estimated at around $200 billion. This brings us to our lesson number 2. Governments can't afford discrimination and biases. They must ensure equal opportunities for the citizens. Social harmony is a prerequisite for a healthy economy. Talking about a healthy economy, reduction of dependencies and economic diversification are its typical characteristics. A significant contribution to the Sri Lankan economy comes from the tourism industry. Apart from directly contributing to the revenue as well as employment generation, the footfalls of foreigners bring in foreign exchange reserves. The 2019 Easter Sunday bombings and the COVID pandemic dealt a death blow to tourism, resulting in the loss of billions of dollars. The annual tourism revenue, which was above $3.6 billion in 2019, came down to less than $0.26 billion in 2021. The country's economy shrank by more than 3.5% in 2020. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has further worsened the situation. Due to the war, tea exports and tourism revenues took a massive hit. Remittances from Sri Lankans working abroad also saw a massive drop. Exports and tourism are the major sources of the nation's income. Together, they contribute around 35% of the country's GDP. Sri Lanka is among the leading producers and exporters of tea in the world. However, Sri Lanka is an import-dependent economy. Due to lower domestic production, it imports more and exports less. It has a trade deficit. The forex reserves have depleted to alarmingly low levels, hampering Sri Lanka's ability to pay for its imports. This has resulted in a shortage of supplies and consequently high domestic inflation. Fuel shortages and power cuts have adversely affected industry operations. Our lesson number 3 is that self-reliance and economic diversification decrease vulnerability to external shocks. In 2019, Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa announced tax cuts before the elections as a populist measure. He became the president in 2019. With him came the sweeping tax cuts, aiming at putting more money in the hands of the people, thereby increasing demand and stimulating the economy. But soon the COVID pandemic hit the world. Subdued demand defeated the purpose of tax cuts and brought about a fall in tax revenue. That resulted in a budget deficit. In other words, the government was spending more than it was earning. Instead of development, the majority of revenue was channelized towards fulfilling short-term election promises and excessive distribution of freebies. Populism attracts people, but it also leads to a situation later on where people are unable to put food on their tables. Then there are protests against the very same representatives who adopted populist measures. In Sri Lanka, the measures adopted by the leaders to stay in power have caused the whole nation to be out of power literally. Residents are forced to face power cuts for more than half the day. The simmering discontent of the people has manifested in form of a wide-scale public rebellion. The Prime Minister's private residence was set on fire. The people are on the streets. The President has fled the country. The country saw a wave of resignations. The Sri Lankan constitution allows a premier to discharge the functions of the President in case the President is ill or absent. Hence, the Prime Minister has got interim presidential powers. The acting president has declared a state of emergency. A nationwide curfew has been imposed as the protests are intensifying. Army personnel have been deployed outside petrol pumps amid the fuel crisis. People are forced to wait hours to refill their LPG cylinders. The residents' savings seem to be vanishing into thin air. In order to protect their savings, people are investing in cryptocurrencies, ignoring the central bank's warning regarding the lack of regulatory oversight of cryptocurrencies and various virtual currency scams. Given the precarious situation, the country is seeking an immediate bailout or moratorium from multilateral agencies like the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. To meet bailout conditions, Sri Lanka had to raise the tax rates. In line with this, the tax relief provided by President Rajapaksa has been withdrawn. There will be an increase in VAT, corporate tax and telecom levy. That brings us to lesson number 4. Populist measures are not sustainable. They lead to short-term political gains but lead to long-term national loss and public suffering. The government remained in denial about its weaknesses. A group of closely connected people were handling the important posts. There was a heavy political influence on all institutions, including the central bank. A weak opposition couldn't combat the government's complacency towards national duty. Mistakes were neither admitted nor rectified before it became too late. For petty gains, state-controlled media let the government evade responsibility. They justified the government's steps by shifting the blame on other people or situations. All of this set the stage for the government's ill-conceived plunge into organic farming. In 2021, aiming to make agriculture 100% organic, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa banned chemical fertilizers. How did he justify this move? By citing health and environmental benefits. The reality was that, due to a steep fall in foreign exchange reserves, the government was forced to cut imports of certain goods. But banning fertilizers proved catastrophic. The farmers were not prepared for the sudden move. The farm output was hit. This adventure resulted in a reduction in the production of rice, which is the local staple. The production of tea, which is a crucial export item, also plummeted. Food shortages led to a surge in prices. And now, amidst the food emergency, the country is finding it hard to prevent market irregularities and hoarding. Such sudden announcements without proper thought are an open invitation to trouble. So lesson number 5 is making informed decisions. Ignorance plus arrogance is equal to malperformance. Research, experience, and suggestions do help. Also, any country is as independent as the independence of its institutions. Media is the fourth pillar of democracy. It must act as a connecting link between the government and the people. And strong opposition is central to a healthy democracy. Economic short-sightedness by successive governments led to the twin deficit problem. What are these twin deficits? Fiscal deficit and current account deficit. The fiscal deficit is the gap between government expenditure and receipts. This gap is what the country needs to borrow for the year. The current account deficit occurs when the value of imports exceeds the value of exports. These two deficits reinforce each other. The government failed to rationalize capital expenditure and trim revenue expenditure. The increase in government expenditure ballooned public debt. Since 2010, the Sri Lankan debt to GDP ratio has been rising. It is over 100% now. Before the sovereign default, almost all government revenue went into debt servicing. Basically, the country was taking on new debt to pay off old debt. And that is not something good borrowers do. Questionable creditworthiness meant that the credit rating agencies downgraded Sri Lankan ratings. What next? The investors fled. Taking loans became expensive for Sri Lanka. Countries issue foreign bonds to raise money. It brings them foreign exchange. Being downgraded meant the loss of access to international markets. Sri Lanka couldn't sell foreign bonds. That reduced the inflows to the foreign exchange reserves. Moreover, the government was draining the existing foreign exchange to meet the debt obligations. As a result of which, the country now lacks enough foreign reserves to pay for even the essential imports. Forget about having sufficient foreign exchange reserves for doing business with the rest of the world. Sri Lanka is forced to temporarily shut down its overseas diplomatic missions to save foreign currency reserves and minimize expenditure. The country is unable to send its sports teams to international events. Foreign channel telecast operations have been suspended due to payment difficulties. Fiscal balance has significant adverse spillover effects on the economy. Successive governments have piled up unsustainable debts. Apart from loans from financial markets, Sri Lanka has also taken loans from institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. After independence from British in 1948, this is the first time in the country's history that it stopped foreign debt payments. The country has no other option than to use the remaining minuscule foreign reserves for critical imports. The government ignored IMF's warning and kept printing money. It did more harm than good. It escalated the skyrocketing prices, currency depreciation, and disappearance of the foreign exchange kitty. Because of the economic and political turmoil, the Sri Lankan rupee has been the worst performing currency of 2022. The default on its debt payment will discourage lenders and investors. Prospects for a quick economic revival are extremely bleak. Our lesson number 6 is fiscal and economic prudence. Effective checks must be placed on government spending. Foreign debt must be maintained at a sustainable level. Inflation must be kept under control. Currency value must be kept at a sustainable level. Resources must be used judiciously, and sufficient strategic reserves must be maintained. Economic warnings and emerging dangers must not be overlooked. In other words, don't pull yourself back from hard but necessary steps. In the past, Sri Lanka has received IMF support 16 times. Often, IMF is accused of being biased towards Western countries. For instance, the United States is the largest financial contributor to the IMF. It is an open secret that the national interests and the foreign policy of the United States are strongly supported by the IMF. IMF provides the bailout packages, but with conditions. Countries feel it to be an interference in their functioning. There is no free lunch. Money comes with strings attached. IMF not just provides money, but also provides instructions regarding how to use that money. This is the reason why Sri Lanka kept turning to China for loans. But why China? because China does not evaluate a borrower's creditworthiness before extending loans. Countries take unsustainable loans from China and get overwhelmed. Eventually, they find themselves in debt distress and are forced to cede strategic leverage to China. This is known as the Chinese debt trap diplomacy. China is known for its predatory lending practices. As per the World Bank, about 37% of the debt service payments of the world's 74 lowest income nations in 2022 are owed to Chinese entities. Talking about Sri Lanka, China enjoys immense political and economic clout in the island nation due to its investments. It had invested over $12 billion between 2006 and 2019 in Sri Lanka. The Chinese share in Sri Lankan's external debt is around 10%. In several countries including Sri Lanka, China has incrementally enlarged its footprint through its Belt and Road Initiative. China gained considerable diplomatic leverage, influence and presence during the presidency of Mahinda Rajapaksa. China has the Sri Lankan Hambantota port on lease for 99 years. It also funded the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, which is known as the world's emptiest airport. Sri Lanka incurred heavy losses due to commercial activities here being far below expectations. The Colombo port project with China has also accelerated the debt crisis. And how has China responded to the Sri Lankan crisis? Given the public outrage and no possibility of financial returns, China has distanced itself from the Rajapaksas as of now. That will make the Sri Lankan stride towards restoring stability more difficult. But China would want to return to doing business when things stabilize. Thus, due to the negative public sentiment against the Rajapaksas, China wants to not appear as being associated with them. That explains why China didn't respond positively to Sri Lanka's requests for debt restructuring. It has restricted itself to sending emergency grants. However, right now for the resource-strapped nation, every penny matters. How has India responded to the Sri Lankan crisis? Just the way a responsible neighbor should. India has so far provided aid worth $3.5 billion to Sri Lanka. Aid supplies include medicines, rice, kerosene, milk powder, etc. Due to the economic crisis, on one hand, companies are diverting their attention from Sri Lanka to India. On the other hand, because of the geographical proximity, India might have to deal with the refugee crisis if the situation worsens. This brings us to our final lesson number 7. It is of vital importance to maximize prudence in international relations. Project feasibility must be assessed and economic viability must be ensured. In this session, we learned 7 precious lessons from Sri Lanka's worst economic crisis in 7 decades. Thank you for your time.